composer wrote this music, and sometimes you feel like, oh, if I can phrase this the best, it's going to be best. I'm going to stand out. But it's not about that. It's about, like, our job as musicians is to do a really good job playing the music that has been written. And so I always have an issue with, I don't want to put myself too much into it, which kind of knocked my confidence a little bit because I wasn't sure that what I was doing was right. But if I took that out of it and I was like, oh, well, this is what's in the music, I'd use my music theory, I'd use whatever. I love that technical stuff, and I would nut it out and be like, well, this is obviously how it goes. It doesn't matter what anyone else says because this is what's written on the page.
When I saw online from Rice University bass professor Tim Pitts that his former student had won a spot in the New Zealand Symphony, I immediately dropped her a line and asked if she'd be on the podcast. She said yes, and here she is today. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting with Alanna Jones, who, like I said, just won a spot in the New Zealand Symphony and has had a great journey, and we've actually had a lot of crossover. She actually spent some time growing up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, then headed to New Zealand, came to San Francisco, where I'm recording this right now, to study with Scott Pingel. She then ended up at Rice University and also spent time in the Sydney Symphony Orchestra Fellowship program. So we talk about all that, her practice routines, what it's like auditioning in Australia and New Zealand, how she managed her time in the weeks and days approaching an audition, and much more. Super fun conversation. You'll hear a bit of her bass playing at the beginning and at the end, so I really hope you enjoy this. And I want to give a shout out to our sponsors, D'Addario Strings, Colstein Music, Steve Swan String Bass, Upton Bass, and the Bass Violin Shop. More on them later in this episode, but let's dig into this conversation with Alanna Jones. So this is the New Zealand Symphony that you won a job?
Yep.
Okay, where, I don't know anything about New Zealand except Lord of the Rings, and it's beautiful, and everybody seems to love it. So, like, what city is that? Is that in Auckland or Wellington? Or?
Yeah, so there are two full-time orchestras in New Zealand. There's the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, which is based in Wellington, which is also the capital. And then there's the Auckland Philharmonia, which is also full-time, and they're based in Auckland.
Okay. So you born and spent some time in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and then headed to, did you move to Auckland then? Is that where you went when you moved to New Zealand when you were young?
Well, we moved actually to a place called Russell, which is in the Bay of Islands. Okay. So that's kind of very far north. It's a very, very small town. It's very small. Okay. But it was great. We lived on a farm for a few years. I did like pony club and farm stuff for a while, and my dad ended up starting up a company in a place called Whangarei, which is a slightly larger town a bit south of the Bay of Islands.
Okay.
And then we lived there for 6 or 7 years, and that's where I started playing before I moved to Auckland for study.
So you started bass then when you moved to that northern farm pony land. Okay.
Well, just after that, because that was quite remote. Okay. But then we moved to, it's kind of like a small, but it's like a large town. It's called Whangarei. Okay. Up in the north, and yeah, it was a little bit. There was a really good community, music community there. And so I was playing in a high school youth orchestra for a bit.
Okay. And then University of Auckland for your undergrad? Is that okay?
Yeah. So I started there with a guy called John Harrison, who's a Hal Robinson grad. And I was there for about a year and a half. And then John got a job somewhere else, or he was going overseas. And he was like, look, since you've got dual citizenship, you should try to audition elsewhere. And so then I was really fortunate to be accepted into SFCM, and I studied with Scott Pingel for the rest of my undergrad.
Okay, so here I just walked by there like 45 minutes ago. So
I know. I think it's so funny that you're in San Francisco. I was like, oh.
I know. Small world, right?
Yep.
Okay, so you spent time in the U.S. and then living in New Zealand, and then you're in San Francisco. So I mean, I what was that experience? Had you spent time in San Francisco prior to that, or was that your first time there, really?
No, I mean, I did the audition. I think when did I do it? The January the year before. So I was there for a little while. It was actually my partner at the time was moving to go to the Academy of Art in San Francisco, and I was looking also into San Diego and other Californian schools because my dad lives in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I was trying not to, worry if I didn't get into San Francisco because my partner lived there, but it worked out really well. So it was great to have him there when I moved over.
So Scott Pingel, great friend, and I played. I think I first met him back in like 2001 or something, before he was even in the San Francisco Symphony, playing in the Spoleto Festival down in South Carolina. So Scott, any memories, favorite memories, anything as a teacher that like.
Yeah, he was actually, I sent him an email the other day because I was like, hey, look, you were such a great teacher, probably like a very, very influential teacher for me. There was definitely this one lesson which I recall to my students sometimes when we're working on something for a long time and they're getting a little bit discouraged, and I'm like, hey, there was this one time where I did an entire lesson on the first two notes of the recit for Beethoven 9, like just the first two notes. And so like you're only getting through the first 4 bars, but hey, anyway, but yeah. I still play those two notes exactly, I hope, how he taught me. I'm not sure, but but that was influential. No, he was really great. He was always really supportive. One of my favorite things is just that he's very considered, and everything that he does musically is for a reason and a purpose, and he doesn't do anything lightly. It's always, I really like that approach towards music. Yeah, very detail oriented. He did a session at the ISB convention last year, 2017, on Mahler, the solo from Mahler's First Symphony, and it was an hour session just on that. And I mean, I think the first 20 minutes were on the first note, right? Then the next 20 minutes were on the next note. So I love it. Yeah. I mean, but I tell you what, after that lesson, I know exactly how that first note of the Beethoven recit goes. Let me tell you. It's great. So you're here in San Francisco, or here where I am in San Francisco, and then studying, and then Rice University is the next chapter, right? Yeah. Well, I actually I took a gap year between San Francisco and Rice. I had a year, and I did the Auckland Philharmonia Fellowship here in New Zealand, which is a really great program. You kind of like work full time in the orchestra for the year. You get mentored by the section, and I had lessons with the principal here, Gordon Hill. And yeah, that was awesome. It was probably the first time that it felt like I was doing a full-time job. So I went through a lot of rep and stuff, and it was auditioning from here that I went to Rice, which was great. There's another Rice grad in the section who's really helpful as well. And she was like, hey, you should go. It's really great. What, is that program that you did in Auckland, is that a year-long program, or can you stay for multiple years? How does that work? That one is, I think, a year-long program because of when I graduated and when I moved over, because of the semesters. I think I came back in like April. So my one was a little bit shorter. It was like April to the end of the season, which is November, December. But yeah, no, usually I think just a year. I can't remember if there's people doing 2 years.
Yeah. I always think it's interesting because we don't actually have that many programs like that in the States.
No.
You know, there's the New World Symphony. Obviously, San Francisco has got a program, this academy, but they're Civic Orchestra of Chicago, but they're few and far between. And aside from New World, you're having to work another job and make ends meet. But if you look in Germany or other countries, it's that apprenticeship, that mentorship, that fellowship it's part of the training. So interesting.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And those have been, so like at the moment I'm doing the Sydney Symphony Fellowship. I'm a second-year fellow there, which is also a great program. I really wish there were more programs like this around, actually.
I wish so too. And so then you Auckland, and then you head to Houston, Texas to study with Tim Pitts, and you're part of the Rice bass studio. And again, I just share any favorite memories of Tim, of your colleagues there, of just the studio in general, anything, what comes to mind when you think of that time?
Oh, it was a really good time. Everyone's really supportive. I mean, one of the big reasons, obviously Tim, but the orchestra and Paul, of course, as well. But the orchestra, I think, was the most fun for me. Even if I was having a hard week, working with Larry in the orchestra was just always a highlight for me. And in the studio, we'd always support each other. Like there was this one time I was practicing in a room, it was one afternoon, and Paul was in for some reason, and he checks his head in, and he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And I'm like, "I'm having trouble with this thing." And he's like, "Oh, let me help you out," and fixed a thing just right. It was great. Anyway, but that kind of environment is just really special. I mean, you don't always get that.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, no, what a great studio and great environment. And Larry Radcliffe, what a fantastic conductor. I played in an orchestra in Chicago called the Chicago Philharmonic, and he was the music director for that. And just the detail that he went into, with that orchestra, or what it sounds like with the Rice Symphony. There's a great video of Larry from like 1985 or something like that, like pretty dated video, some mid-80s VHS transfer of him just talking about what it takes to be a really good conductor, and it's super interesting. So yeah, one of the greats in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think he's it's not always that you find a conductor who is able to treat an orchestra. Well, it's essentially an advanced youth orchestra, the Rice School Orchestra. But he well walks the line between treating us like professionals, but also teaching us. So I never felt like I was being talked down to, and I also felt like I really wanted to do a good job. And that kind of teacher is few and far between. So yeah, I think he's a pretty special person.
With Upton Bass, there is a lot of dialogue back and forth between Upton and the person they're designing the bass for. Here's Gary and Eric on that topic.
By the time I'm taking an order, we may have a dozen emails. We got a couple phone calls back and forth. I mean, it is extremely rare that the phone rings, "Hey, first-time caller, here's my credit card."
Yeah.
We've got a relationship.
Hours and hours and hours.
Right. So Gary and I have, we've listened to you enough that within your budget, we've gotten you into the right bass the first time.
Listening is what it's all about, and that's what Gary and Eric and everybody at Upton excel in so spectacularly. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thanks so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which carries all of the essential double bass accessories and gadgets, including pickups, strings, bow cases, wheels, bass covers, mutes, quivers, rosin, polish, and more. Learn more about all those accessories and all the other things they offer at bassviolinshop.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. There are a lot of career options out there for musicians, and Barry Colstein of Colstein Music has some great advice about keeping your options open.
I generally will tell anybody that goes off to, going as performance, go after your dreams, but also prepare yourself, because it's not always the easiest profession to pursue. And I'm a firm believer that in life you pick up as much knowledge as you can. Those are your armament in life, and you put them in your back pocket. You may never have to draw upon it, but it's a nice thing to have.
Colstein & Sons, for 70 years now, has been working to connect bass players with the finest instruments and help them achieve their goals and find those opportunities in their lives. Thank you so much to Barry and everybody at Colstein Music for sponsoring the podcast. Either while you were in San Francisco or then going back to New Zealand and then back at Rice, like, were you taking professional auditions during that time, or were you just kind of going step by step through your training? What did that look like?
Well, I came to the bass kind of late. I started playing when I was 18, so I didn't take any professional auditions until much later as well, because I just felt like there was more for me to do. My first audition was my first live audition. I think I'd sent in some tapes to places, but my first live one was the end of 2015. And I flew back to Australia, and they had two auditions, actually. The opera ballet and the symphony had an audition each within 5 days, which is silly because the lists were completely different. But there was me and one other person who was crazy enough to do both, but it worked out anyway. But yeah, those are my first auditions. After you do that much rep, there aren't many lists that scare you, I think.
I'm sure. Yeah, that's a lot of music and a real different pool of music you're drawing from. And I'd love to know either this audition that you just won, the New Zealand Symphony, or the auditions, those two auditions in Australia, or just like, how do auditions? What would I be surprised about going and auditioning in either New Zealand or Australia? Is the system exactly the same as like taking a San Francisco Symphony audition, or is it way different, or what are your experiences?
I'm not sure I could answer that very well. I actually never took any American auditions. Mm-hmm. I kind of wish I had in hindsight now, but I don't know. The only odd thing that I can think of is because Australia and New Zealand are kind of closely linked in ways. Every time they have a new audition, we have to do a local round first, which means only Australian and New Zealand citizens are allowed to audition before they go international. But as far as I'm aware, the rest of the process is pretty similar.
Is it screened, or have the ones you done, are they screened for the preliminaries? Okay.
Usually the first round is always screened. The second round sometimes, depending on the orchestra, is screened, and then the third round is almost always not screened.
Okay. Mm. And what is a list in your experience with what you've taken, at least, like, what's a list look like? Is it you got some Beethoven 5 and 9, some Bach, concertos? What do you see, or what have you seen?
Yeah, there's a mixture of both the standard things that I worked on at school and some odd things. For example, you usually get Beethoven 5, you usually get a Mozart symphony, you usually get some Strauss, either Don Juan or Heldenleben. Sometimes you get some Mahler. I've seen slow movements of Mahler, as well as like Mahler 2. An odd one was the opening to Schubert's Unfinished, just like the first 8 bars or something. And often we'll get the Bach violin concerto excerpt.
The slow movement, the E minor?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other odd ones. I can't. Yeah, ooh. The recits. They like to put the recits on.
Okay. Yeah, no, those are interesting. And yeah, the Schubert Unfinished. I wonder why that's I've heard of that being on auditions, but I've never seen that on a list in the States for an audition I've taken, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I think it's probably if you decide to take that D down on your extension and you haven't got a capo, maybe it's for the shift or musicality. But no, I think there's a lot that shows there. But in terms of there's a lot more talk about color and style down here, and so that kind of excerpt would be an opportunity to show how you could play with a really dark sound.
You know, so it's interesting. Different countries and different regions. You know, if we look at the bass, where we see, you know, go to Germany, obviously German bow. Go to Italy, French bow by and large. Some countries everybody's sitting low. Some places everybody's standing. Some places like the States, it's a mixture or it's regional. Any trends in terms of any of that bass geekery, either in New Zealand or Australia in your experience? Like, are you seeing more German bow, more French bow, more standing, more sitting? Any observations?
It's a pretty good mix, to be honest. There's a lot of there are people from Uzbekistan, or there are people playing here from the States. There are people from Europe. There are people from Germany. And just in the bass section, they're both quite mixed bass. Well, so far mixed bass sections, and good mix between German and French bow. Mostly people sit. I haven't seen any orchestras that stand yet. I would say just a really lovely mix. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And then just auditioning in general, that's something people love to hear about. So, and I think I always like connecting with someone after they won an audition, because to me, it's an indication of you figured something out. You figured out how to practice and make some long-term improvements. So a couple things that I like to dig into, and I just love your thoughts, are like, if you think back to preparation, like do you remember when any aha moments in terms of your audition preparation? Like, no dice, this isn't working, oh, I sound terrible, I walk out and bomb, and then all of a sudden like, aha, I think I figured this out. Are there any of those aha moments you can think of over the last few years?
I wouldn't say that there was like a specific time where it was like, oh, this is what it is. It was kind of a culmination of, I was taking lessons, I was listening to myself, I was trying to figure out what was happening. So I was taking auditions, I was always getting past the first round, I was sometimes getting past the second round, but I would never get a trial at the end. There was like 10% missing off the end, and I couldn't figure out what that 10% was. And it became more and more apparent that from all the different people that I studied with, which in their own way were awesome, had a bunch of ideas that I had taken on board that didn't really work together. And so I had a lot of, I don't want to say garbage, but in terms of like extra information that was not important or that was conflicting to each other that I needed to kind of sift through and find one way of doing these things that was true to the way that I thought they should work.
Okay.
And it was this lesson that I had. It was talking about the concept of ego, which is not like, oh, I'm the best, whatever. It's about, the composer wrote this music, and sometimes you feel like, oh, if I can phrase this the best, it's going to be best. I'm going to stand out. But it's not about that. It's about, like, our job as musicians is to do a really good job playing the music that has been written. And so I always have an issue with, I don't want to put myself too much into it, which kind of knocked my confidence a little bit because I wasn't sure that what I was doing was right. But if I took that out of it and I was like, oh, well, this is what's in the music, I'd use my music theory, I'd use whatever. I love that technical stuff, and I would nut it out and be like, well, this is obviously how it goes. It doesn't matter what anyone else says because this is what's written on the page. And so when I started from that and started working on my excerpts like that, it became a lot more important what I was doing, and like a lot more, real, I guess. I felt like it was easier to see the truth of what to play, which gave me more conviction as a player. And it was the conviction that I was missing in the auditions, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. How about in terms of a lot of people do extensive mock auditions and playing in front of other people, and then you mentioned recording, and certainly that plays into probably just about anybody's preparation these days. How often did you play for people? How often did you record? When did you record? When did you play for people? Did you like hibernate a couple weeks before the audition, or just talk about that? People love to hear about that.
Yeah, well, I have a background in sports coaching. I used to do gymnastics, like competitive gymnastics coaching for a long time. And I would use for my athletes a tapering program towards competitions that I actually kind of adopted myself. So I know like a lot of people talk about sports psychology and music, but it's incredibly applicable, And so I would, a few months out, get the list, take things slowly, work on the mechanics of how I wanted to do things. And then once I felt like that was under my fingers, I would eventually start, doing more running, practicing, performing, taking lessons. I like playing for people kind of much sooner than later. I feel like it's a really good goal to get on top of things. And usually about 2 weeks out, I stop playing for people because it's that conviction thing. That's the thing where personally I would struggle. And so I would want to know that whatever I was doing, I would feel confident doing it. In terms of recording, I would do little mocks for myself every day leading up to the audition. And the most important thing is I would think about my warm-up routine on the day, and I would practice whatever my warm-up routine would be on the day of the audition. I would try to make that the same so that it would feel like it was just another day that I was in the practice room. And for me, that's, doing a few scales, some long notes, playing through some spots, some excerpts, top and tailing some things. And then I would do a run and record it. And after I recorded it, I would take a wee break, come back and mentally note which bits didn't go well. And then I'd do my practice that day. And then the following morning, I would start by listening to that run-through recording as like a panel member rather than a player, if that makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, no, I love how each day gets sort of like continued from the last day. And I love these nerdy details, so forgive me, but like about how many hours do you think you averaged bass in hand as you were approaching, and maybe that differs 6 weeks out or 4 weeks out or the week of, what did that look like?
Bass in hand. So I don't have the best endurance. I get sore and tired really easy. So I would try to do a really efficient warm up, and maybe I'd probably not get over 3 or 4 hours. 4 hours would be pushing it. I would try to aim for 2.5, 3, just, and closer to the audition, even like less time with the bass in hand, much more mental practice.
This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Here's a great tip. Change your strings 2 at a time, removing them from the inside out, then replacing them from the outside in allows for easy access to the lower pegs, ensuring strings lay neatly in the peg box. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass, and I've always been impressed by how Steve manages to get basses sounding so vibrant, whether it's a student-level bass or a top-of-the-line professional bass. Here's Steve on some of what he has learned in terms of setup.
When steel strings came into general use around 1959, the German bass makers flipped out, and they really got scared that they're going to get big shiploads of basses back that got wrecked by these high-tension steel strings. And so they did 3 things that really changed the function of the instrument. They shortened the string length, and they lowered the neck angle so the bridges weren't that tall anymore. And then they made the tops a lot thicker. They really wanted to ensure that these basses were not going to come back across the ocean for work anymore. And so the basses tend to sound kind of nasal, and they didn't have any depth. They didn't have a chest voice at all. And so what we do with increasing the neck angle, and we can also increase the overstands for modern playing, can get up into thumb position a lot easier. So a neck reset can accomplish that. Sometimes we'll transplant a neck or make a new neck for these basses that might have a string length that are not friendly to modern playing.
Learn more about what Steve can do to get your bass playing better, and check out his great selection of basses at steveswanstringbass.com. And thanks for sponsoring the podcast, Steve. Mental practice and scheduling it out kind of like your other. So maybe you do 2-3 hours and do some mental practice. How did did you actually sit down and say like it's mental practice time, or was it something like when you're walking around, or how did that work?
Well, the majority of my mental practice was I went on to Spotify Premium, which is a great tool, and I would listen through a bunch of different recordings of my excerpts, and I'd pick out my favorite ones and I put them on my playlist for my audition. And slowly I'd filter out the ones that I liked less and less over the time as I was working on things. So I'd have one recording of each of my excerpts, and I would use those as like a reference. And so I just sit there and I kind of like use my left hand on my arm to finger, and would just run through it mentally. And so it's like practicing that performance routine where like these things I'm thinking about here. I'm thinking about my bow being here. I'm thinking about my phrasing going in this direction. And I don't need the bass in my hand to do that, but I can still practice that sequence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the recording helped a lot because it's great hearing the orchestra, and it's something that I also tried to do during the audition process is bring the orchestra. A lot of people say, bring the orchestra to you on stage.
Right? No, absolutely. And finding your favorite recording at Spotify Premium. Yes, that's an outstanding. Back in the late 90s when I was taking auditions, like a radically different world. It's just remarkable what some of the positives of technology.
Yeah.
How did that for let's say the New Zealand Symphony audition or anything else you've done, are all the rounds typically in one day, or is it spread out over a couple of days?
Yeah, so the largest audition that I've attended down between Australia and New Zealand was a Sydney one, and there were maybe 18 live. So they easily go in one day. I think most of the new NZSO ones were and I haven't seen more than 4 people live, but they usually get a lot of tapes because of how far away they are from everyone.
So another thing that people have asked a lot about, and I'd love to hear, is like just endurance throughout the day. So let's say you're doing that, and even, that's a lot of playing if you're going to get up and play 3 rounds, no matter how you look at it. So you've got this warm-up routine that you work out, and I'm assuming you do that the day of or before the first round. And then you play the first round, and then what happens? You probably got a little bit of time. So what does it look like? Either bass in hand or mental practice or chilling out and listening to recordings. What happens after that first round for you?
Well, yeah. So like I said, endurance is a huge obstacle for me. I usually try to play as little as possible and do as much mental practice as possible. I like also to feel prepared, which is kind of a difficult 2 things to have. But usually, so I'd get there, I warm up. I try not to warm up for too long, but I do find that scales are really, really important to the warm up, like just to get my hand where it needs to go. I'll start some excerpts. After the first round, I put the bass down and walk away, wait for the round to finish. While that's happening, we probably haven't got the second round materials if we're going on. So I literally just sit in a corner and put on something that's not classical music and let my brain rest and eat food. Oh man, it is so important to eat food.
It is. What do you eat on an audition day? Do you have something specific? For me, it was always bananas. But in fact, I can't eat bananas to this day because I think I'm going to be taking an audition. So
oh my gosh. I believe it. No, just anything food. I usually get a sandwich with some boiled eggs. Like protein is important, I reckon. Muesli bars. Sometimes you need a little bit of extra sugar. I don't know. Yeah. But no, there was this one audition I took, and I was so nervous. It meant so much, this audition that I was taking. I really tried to eat something for breakfast, and I just couldn't. And I got to the audition. I did the first round, and I usually don't get bow shakes. I can't recall a time where I've been like, oh, I've got a shaky bow. This is really hard. I usually am pretty good. And I was doing the Otello excerpt, and every single long note at the end would just be shaky bow. And I was like, what is happening? And finished the audition and went straight to my sandwich. So always eat food. Doesn't matter if you feel sick.
Important lesson.
Yes, absolutely. But going back to after the round, it's for me just about resting. Usually when I warm up, I try to warm up only the excerpts on that round so that I don't have to do too much. Because I've also done some auditions where the list is enormous. If I wanted to get through the whole list in a day, that would be a day of practice. It's that's good. But yeah, so I would then warm up the second round in the second round. Another thing I started doing, like I said, because I like to be prepared, which is maybe a little bit over the top, but I would usually listen through and mental practice the list before I arrived at the audition venue. So I felt like I had already looked at everything, but I hadn't played everything physically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, folks listening, Spotify Premium, make the list, and again, because that's incredibly, and just like you said, bring the orchestra with you, right? It's just so obvious, at least in my experience, whether someone really is hearing the clarinets and the cellos and the sweep of the orchestra, and so that's really cool.
It makes you feel like you're playing in time. It helps you with your rhythm, helps you with, what colors you want to make, and makes a big difference.
What's going through your mind right before you walk out? Is your heart rate racing? Do you have some sort of routine or mantra, or are you just thinking through the music? What's going through your mind?
You mean like when they open the door to go onto the stage?
Yeah, or in those that lovely 90 seconds or 2 minutes, 3 minutes where you're just waiting back there. Yeah, do you have anything, or are you just trying to stay in the game? How does that work?
Yeah, I guess I try to stay focused. I try not to talk to many people as I'm waiting. But when they open the door, I kind of like puff out my chest, so to speak, and take the biggest steps I can. Walking sometimes over heels as like walking onto the stage, and they make a good strong click, and I feel very much like this is my space, this is what I have to play, and I feel like that gives me a sense of confidence, and it's like I don't know.
Love it. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, so this is super fun. I'm so glad, and I would love to. I'd love to do this again sometime. About any, and we could, whether it's life in the New Zealand orchestra, or whether it's some sort of panel discussion or something. I usually round these chats out with some advice for your younger self. And it's interesting that you started bass at 18. You could talk to Alanna at 18 or when you were in Auckland doing the program, or whatever age you choose. But what advice would you give your slightly younger self, I guess?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I think it would probably be to take auditions sooner. Like, you don't want to take auditions before you feel you're ready. But because like my first live audition was halfway through my master's, I would have liked to had a bit more experience under my belt. Like, there were a few auditions that I felt like if I had a bit more experience in taking auditions in terms of how I approach them and how I, find my confidence and conviction in them, it would have been nice to have that for some auditions earlier on down here. But that maybe that's it. But I think
I think that's good advice. Well, from Green Bay, Wisconsin to New Zealand, back to San Francisco, where I am here, and Rice and everywhere you've been, it's super cool. Congratulations again.
Oh, thanks.
And best of luck with the new job.
Thank you.
Alanna, thank you so much for being on the show. Really excited to chat with you, and I hope we do it again soon. You've got a lot of career ahead of you for sure. And isn't this a fun conversation, folks? What a cool person. And I love chatting with people from anywhere, but especially outside of the United States. It's great for me to learn what a big world it is, both in terms of the double bass world and the music world in general. So thanks, Alanna, and let's definitely do it again soon. If you'd like to reach out and you've got a suggestion for a guest, maybe someone who, like Alanna, just won an audition, or anybody that you think would be interesting for the show, let me know. Feedback at Contrabass Conversations is the email to get in touch with me, and we take those suggestions and look at them and put them in our database and sift through them, and that's how we base the show going forward in the weeks, months, years. Sometimes we don't get to suggestions right away. It's just there are a lot of people out there. It's a big world. But we really appreciate any feedback you've got in terms of that, or anything, or topics you'd like covered, or any of that sort of stuff would be great. find us online at our website, contrabassconversations.com, and also anywhere you hang out in terms of social media. We're there. And download our app if you haven't. That continues to get updated, and it's for iOS, Android, and Kindle. And you can actually search for topics or various guests, or even if you're looking for like practicing, if you type practicing into the app, you'll find all the episodes very nice and neatly laid out. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch is making great basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and you can learn more at mitchmooring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.